Welcome back. Now we're going to talk about Iran. Iran ranks in the top 20 in terms of size and population in the world, with about 70 million people. It is the fourth largest oil producer and with the second largest known gas reserves in the world. So it's a big one. It's long been held in check by Iraq, with which it fought a long, bloody war shortly after the Iranian Revolution from 1980 to 1988. And then, of course, we invaded Iraq. Iraq is much weaker today, which leaves lots of questions about how Iran is going to function. And so we've got Iran right here, there's Iraq right here, and with no Iraq to keep it in check, there are lots of questions about what's going to happen. In terms of ethnicity, this is not an Arab country. This is a Persian country. About 50% of the population speaks Farsi. 25% are Azeri. These are a Turkic people. They're also Shiite, like most of the Persians. Then you've got Kurds who make up less than 10%. You've got Arabs, but Arabs and Turkmen and others are a very small minority. It's a very young country. The median age is about 25. Just like in India, which was also about 25. But unlike in some of the other cases that we've looked at, including Japan, where the median age is around 40, 36 in the US, 39 in the UK, 40 in France. So remember, when we're talking about these advanced democracies, these advanced industrial states, oftentimes you have higher populations that are in the later age range, higher populations. So we're talking about an older population, which makes it very difficult to actually maintain them. We've talked about this a couple times already. What do? Well, you can pay lots of money for people to have babies, or you can allow for more immigration. Either one has its potential drawbacks, especially in the more homogenous states like Japan and France, as we've seen. Iran is another case where we've seen a major period of urbanization, this time fairly recently, in the 1970s. Not surprisingly, 1970s is when the revolution happens. You've got urbanization, but this also means dislocation. This was an agrarian and semi-nomadic state or society prior to the 1970s, and suddenly people are brought into the cities. I guess one more outstanding thing to mention, as we talked about in the non-democratic section, how this is probably the best example today of a theocratic regime. It also has the second most death penalties after China in the world. So it usually averages around 200, 300, 400. In 2012, it had 253. Importantly, often the death penalty has been used to intimidate the opposition. So, for example, between the disputed June 2009 election and August of 2009, you had 115 executions. These weren't members of the opposition. They were mostly violent criminals and drug dealers, but this was seen as a sign that the government was ready to deal with enemies harshly. So we'll talk a little bit about Iran's evolution, and then we'll get into the institutions, which are pretty fascinating in this case. So we're talking about a very large empire with lots of state-like functions, including standardized currency, weights and measures, a very long royal highway, 1,200 mile long royal highway, centralized state that stretched from Afghanistan to Greece and Egypt. So it really went all over the place. So we're talking about a very large empire with lots of state-like functions, including standardized currency, weights and measures, a very long royal highway, 1,200 mile long royal highway, that takes you right up here, Susa to Sardis, although I suppose it ended here at some point. Oh, sorry, going back. Shouldn't have touched it. So this is a fairly wealthy and technologically sophisticated state for its time. But in 334 BC, it is toppled by Alexander the Great, who then dies. And what happens when you've got the death of a personalistic regime? Breakup. Competition for power, as we've seen in a couple of the other states that we've already looked at so far. So this snapshot of the early evolution of Iran should remind you of some other cases and some comparative questions that might emerge from this. When do we have, to what degree are empires strong? What accounts for their strength? What accounts for the decline of empires? So some things to think about. And maybe I'll put a discussion question up like that. Good idea. Maybe. So we could talk about. So this is with the Persian Empire. As I mentioned, we've got a decentralized government. But you've got the rise of Islam. Other empires did rise in this area, but none were as strong as Cyrus's. And it is that we connect to those various states, Polish, Hungarian, etc., were the language of the people. This dominance of the Arabs really stays until Arab raiders, and Arabic becomes the state language. Farsi is still the language of the people. This isn't uncommon. In much of Europe, you had Latin being the state language. Well, the languages that we connect to those various states, Polish, Hungarian, etc., were the language of the people. This dominance of the Arabs really stays until the 11th century, and during this period, the state is headed by a caliph who's a political and religious leader. There were periodic here in particular. There was this discrimination against non-Arabs, which led to a lot of this. So sorry, I should be. Oh man, it's frozen. Oh, everything's frozen. These were stirred by very concrete grievances of the same sorts that we've seen in some of the other cases. And here in particular, there was this discrimination against non-Arabs, which led to a lot of this. So sorry, I should be. Oh man, it's frozen. Oh, everything's frozen. Oh, hold on. Hey, this is going badly. Okay. We're back on track. Sorry. I just pretend none of that happened. So you've got the arrival of Islam, and sorry, I'm a slide behind. So Arabic is adopted as a state language. This is also the period of this blossoming Persian culture, where you have Persian literature, philosophy, medicine, art, and these contribute to this Islamic golden age, which peaks in the 10th to 11th centuries. All good things must end, and here, sure enough, the Mughals, aka the Mongols, come along from the 13th to the 15th centuries and devastate the economy and depopulate the state to a significant degree. More than half of Iran's population is wiped out by Genghis Khan. So we're talking about extermination and famine beginning in the 1200s, and later Tamerlane, whose capital was in Samarkand, now Uzbekistan, came along and ruled over this empire, and he was also ruthless. He had massive massacres. All of this left the Iranians, or people, the Persians at this point, weak. There was a lack of centralized power. Again, this was an empire, so it was focused around tributes that local states provided for. So tributes are sort of like taxes. But the local leaders would collect them, and then the Mughals would come in and take them. By the 16th century, you have major change, though, in the works. You have the rise of the Safavids. There are lots of competitive pressures because you have both internal, in terms of the sort of chaos, as well as external from the empire, from the Ottoman Empire. And ultimately, the Safavid dynasty wins out, and they adopt Shi'ism, which developed actually in the 7th century rift, and connects religion and the state. This is Iran's first period of independent Islamic rule. You've got a highly centralized state. You've got increased stability. You've got increased commerce. And so this is, again, the centralization of Iran and the strengthening of the state. I should note that they adopted Islam, but it was Persian Islam, not Arabic culture. So it's quite different. It's a Shia Islam. Shiites account for about 1/10 of all Muslims in the world. The Sunnis are the dominant section of Islam. Both are based on the Quran, but Shia Islam holds that Muhammad's family and some of his descendants have special spiritual and political rule over the community, and that Ali, Muhammad's cousin, was the rightful successor to Muhammad. So they reject the legitimacy of the first three Rashidun caliphs who ruled after his death. It's a messianic view. They're waiting for the return of Ali, who's this hidden imam. You've got a powerful clergy, and there's emphasis on martyrdom. So just some caveats about the difference between Islam in Iran versus much of the Arab world, where Sunni Islam dominates. So anyway, you do have the rise of this first Islamic state in Iran dating back to the 16th century. By the 19th century, though, you've got Europe expanding, especially Russia from the north and the UK from the east. If you recall from the last set of lectures, the UK had taken India, it was working on Afghanistan, so it was approaching. And so under pressure, the Qajar dynasty leaders sought to westernize, adopting a Western economic model, Western political institutions. So again, look at the competitive pressures and think about how this relates to the evolutionary theory. Where else did we see this? Think about that. Where else did we see this? Someone saying, the samurai modernizers in Japan. That's right. Someone else is saying, well, you've got the top-down modernizers in Russia. And that's right, too. Sorry, my dog just knocked over a bottle. So we've seen this before, and someone else said something else, and you're probably right as well, because there are a number of connections that we could be making. In Japan, around roughly that same period. So here in Iran, you've got a constitution. We're angry at it, and in 1906 they launched a series of protests, and these protests lead to the first constitutional monarchy here in Iran. I remember the same sorts of things we saw happening around the same time in Russia, in Japan, around roughly that same period. So here in Iran, you've got a constitution and the evolution, well, the advent, I should say, of this legislative body known as the Majlis. The picture that you see here is the king in the Majlis, so in the legislative body. Of course, as we've seen from other cases, all this was really short-lived. The monarch tries to rein this in. Meanwhile, the UK and Russia are dividing Iran essentially into spheres of influence. The Russians have to bow out following the 1917 Communist Revolution, and then the Brits become dominant, although the Majlis maintains a very anti-British stance. And this leads to the British desire and willingness to, in 1921, support a military coup by Reza Khan. And that's where we come to. Let me take the 20th century in another slide, one that's not as jumbled as all this.